Broadcasting from the Unshackled Studios in Melbourne. This is WilmsFront, brought to you by theunshackled.net. Now here's Tim Wilms.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to WilmsFront. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to WilmsFront. Second WilmsFront show week in a row. So I've got another one in store for you tonight on this Thursday, the 13th of October, 2022. We are live on the WilmsFront YouTube, DLive, and Odyssey channels, as well as on the Interactive Entropy software. Hello to everyone in the live chats. It is 8:30 p.m. here in Melbourne, Victoria, where the COVID pandemic is officially over, with Dan Andrews deciding not to renew the pandemic declaration for another 3 months. This means that those who test positive for COVID are no longer mandated to isolate, nor do they have to report a positive RAT result through the government. This removal of one of the last remaining COVID restrictions when it comes to not having to have mandatory isolation will come into effect throughout the rest of Australia tomorrow. The official end to the pandemic in Victoria is good timing for Dan Andrews, who is facing an election in less than 2 months on November 26, and wants Victorians to forget about what he did to them these past 2.5 years, including 262 days of police state lockdown. Despite Dan's tyrannical and corrupt government, the Victorian Liberal opposition, led by Matthew Guy, is far behind in the current polls. The Liberals lost government in South Australia back in March, and the coalition government lost federally in May. So this means that the Liberals are now only in power in 2 states, New South Wales and Tasmania. The New South Wales state election is due in March 2023. And the Perrottet government is behind in the polls. Tasmania's next state election isn't due until May 2025. So how should the Liberal and National parties, the coalition, rebuild to both win back their base of conservative and libertarian voters, but also to win back government with the broader electorate? Or are they beyond redemption, and should conservatives and libertarians support pro-freedom minor parties like One Nation, the United Australia Party, and the Liberal Democrats? That's what we are going to explore tonight with my guest, who I spoke to earlier this evening. Our interview goes for 1 hour and 10 minutes, and then I'll be back with you live to wrap up the show. In the meantime, enjoy the discussion, and I'll be with you in the live chat.
This is WilmsFront, brought to you by theunshackled.net.
Rocco Loiacono is a senior lecturer at Curtin University Law School. He practiced as a lawyer for 10 years, most of that time with Clayton Utz, one of Australia's largest law firms. He also has a PhD from the University of Western Australia, which he earned in 2014. His research areas are translation difficulties arising from the differences that exist between continental legal systems and English common law. He is a NAATI certified translator, so Italian to English, and served as national president of the Australia Institute of Interpreters and Translators from 2017 to 2019. He has also written about the role the law should play in defending fundamental rights and freedoms, with many important contributions during the coronavirus tyranny, which have been featured in the Spectator Australia, Quadrant Online, the Epoch Times, the Australian, as well as in the Western Australian Jurist. He's also a member of the Western Australian Legal Theory Association and member of the Institute of Public Affairs. He is also the co-author with Professor Augusto Zimmermann of the book Deconstructing ScoMo, Critical Reflections on Australia's 30th Prime Minister. Augusto was a guest on WilmsFront pre the federal election. So we have Rocco with us tonight for the sequel. As post-election, he's been writing about how the Liberal Party needs to rebuild both federally and in the state divisions. Rocco, welcome to WilmsFront.
Thanks for having me, Tim. It's a pleasure.
So let's start with, it's been, 4 months now since the Morrison government, which was for 8 3/4 years, the Abbott-Turnbull-Morrison government. Yes. So from the election result, it was the coalition that lost badly. Labor, the new Albanese government, just fell over the line. But in your opinion and analysis, why did they lose, and what were the failures of its period in government?
How long have we got? Look, succinctly, the coalition lost because it didn't govern like a coalition government should. They were in government for 8 3/4 years. And other than AUKUS, I really can't see for much of that time that the coalition government actually did anything that's worthy of a centre-right government. I mean, look what's happened since, the 4 months since the election, right? The Albanese government has moved at light speed to implement its agenda. It has not wasted a single minute. This is where centre-right parties suffer from what Nigel Farage called conservative cowardice. And that's why the coalition lost, because it did not argue for and try and implement the things it says it stands for. It didn't lean into the culture wars. It didn't reform Section 18C. It didn't make any worthwhile economic reform contributions at all. And particularly during the last 2.5 years, abandoned the things that it actually says it stands for, like freedom of association, freedom of speech, and all those things. I mean, you had Scott Morrison in 2017 when they tried to get an 18C reform through. He said free speech doesn't create a single job. And therein lies the problem, because you've got people in there that aren't willing to actually prosecute the case for conservative values. Whereas you look at the left, they do not waste a single minute implementing their agenda. We know what they stand for and they carry it out. Whereas with the coalition parties, you could argue, well, one, we didn't know what they stood for because they spent a lot of time trying to become Labor light, particularly when we saw on economic issues and on freedom of religion, freedom of association concerns, and also when push came to shove to actually fight for things, they squibbed it. I mean, the religious freedom bill was left to the very last minute before the election. And even then it was they made an absolute hash of it. So this is what happens when you stand for nothing. If you abandon your base, you lose. If you go and adopt in policies that are completely contrary to what would be the base, you lose. And many have said, including the Spectator Australia editor Rowan Dean, the day Scott Morrison lost the election was in November last year, when he went off to COP26 and committed Australia to that net zero insanity, which is perversely the issue on which he actually won the 2019 election, when Australians didn't want that kind of policy, and they made it quite clear in 2019 that they didn't want that kind of policy. Yet people said, well, look, there's no difference between the coalition and the Labor Party. And when it comes to the voters, like a lot of things, instead of choosing a photocopy, a poor photocopy at that, they'll choose the real thing. So the key thing is, to sum all that up, When you abandon your principles, you abandon your base, you lose. And that is why they lost.
Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister, he made the only attempt to repeal 18C. And I'm from Victoria, so I know that left-wing Labor governments waste no time pushing through their ideological agendas. Even in between our lockdowns, they were still pushing through the parliament various laws that they wanted, such as the conversion therapy ban. And you just talked about it, the federal level, that leaving it to the last minute and making a hash of it, the proposed religious discrimination bill. It seems to me that the strategy of the modern liberal parties at both state and federal level is just, we're going to be stable economic managers, and if you let Labor in, they're going to wreck the joint and put up your taxes. That's basically the, well, that was the 2022 federal election strategy of the Liberals. That awful earworm, more taxes are coming. That was basically the campaign, and it didn't work.
And it didn't work because they didn't actually practice it. I mean, look at the fiscal profligacy of the coalition governments, particularly over the last 3 years. Spending like drunken sailors, and in the end, people again saw no difference between the coalition and Labor as far as prudent economic management is concerned. I mean, since the coalition came to office, and I know Tony Abbott tried, and I'll get to that. I'll get to that in a minute. But really, since 2014, 2015, there really has been no attempt by a coalition government to actually rein in spending and make the necessary reforms to try and keep up its mantle as the prudent economic managers. We still have one of the highest personal/company tax rates in the OECD. Not to mention the $1 trillion deficit. But the other thing too is that there was timidity shown in this area as well, as far as tax reform is concerned as well, and industrial relations reform. I mean, there was an attempt by the then Attorney General Christian Porter to tinker at the edges, but again, there was no actual going in and arguing the case for these reforms. And in the end, Morrison, with this typical attitude of his, shelved the reforms to try and get on with the ACTU throughout the coronavirus. And therein lies the issue with the coalition and the conservative or so-called conservative parties in this country, that they're not actually prepared. They're not actually prepared to do anything to defend the mantle of prudent economic managers, among a host of other things, because while they might say these words about, look, you know, that if you elect Labor, it'll be worse than what it is now, the reality is, in practice, they're just as bad.
Going to you mentioned the 2014 Abbott hockey budget, which was an attempt to rein in the size and spending of the federal government, but the intense media backlash, that's what we should call it, and the blocking in the Senate had a lasting impact on the remainder of the coalition's time in government. And you mentioned industrial relations; they're still scarred from the work choices Howard lost in 2007. So the trauma of attempting a reform seems to just linger with them. And a similar thing's happened in Queensland when the Campbell-Newman government got turfed out after one term. The LNP in opposition, they basically want to memory hole the Campbell-Newman years, and he said that they treat me like Voldemort now.
Yeah. Well, 2007 is, we're coming up to 15 years now. You know, that's a long time ago. That's a long time ago. And what do you, I mean, what are you going to keep doing? I mean, are you going to keep thinking that you can't do anything because it went so badly before? It's this, people elect their politicians to do something that they think will better their lives. Now, I'm not saying that the coalition parties have to go in, you know, within a year they have to do anything, that you adopt a crash or crash through policy. But we also have to look at why these things didn't happen and why these things occurred. Now, in 2014, as you mentioned, there was a Senate that was blocking. Now, there were certain characters in that Senate, which, and I've said before, and I'll say it again, I think the Abbott government was actually cursed because it won in a thumping majority in the lower house, but it had that completely unworkable Senate with some, shall we say, interesting characters. But also at the time, you had a certain Clive Palmer who wasn't actually contributing favourably to the debate.
Yes, this was Palmer version 1.
Yeah, Palmer version 1 was the version that brought out Al Gore to Australia.
I remember.
Yeah. So look, you can't actually, I think, say, well, look, reform doesn't work because people don't want it. You have to look at the circumstances in which that reform was tried, and also don't forget. You mentioned Joe Hockey at the time. In my view, he lost control of that debate because it turned from a budget emergency into an economic emergency. Now, how that happened, I mean, obviously that's an issue for the players at the time, but it contributed to that media hysteria you were talking about, that they weren't able to control. They weren't able to control that aspect of the debate. And the other thing too, at the time, because of that, they weren't able to actually explain and articulate why these reforms were necessary. You look at politicians like John Howard and Bob Hawke. The majority, or indeed at various times, their poll performance was probably worse than Tony Abbott ever had, or the Abbott-led government ever had. But at the end of the day, because of their conviction and because of their political skills, they were able to explain to the people why these reforms were necessary and were able to carry them through. And that's what's also lacking, particularly in the coalition parties at the moment. And mind you, it's a disease on both sides of politics. But particularly in the coalition parties, there's no one there that's actually able to articulate sensible centre-right programs or policies and actually defend them and say why they're necessary and explain, well, look, we're not going to do this, that and the other. Again, I go back to John Howard in leading up to the 1996 election. I mean, the ALP tried to bring up every kind of scare campaign about his previous statements on Medicare, on industrial relations, on the environment, you name it. They threw the kitchen sink at him. But he was able to successfully put together policies and carry them out, which still were worthy of a centre-right government, but also didn't make the mistakes of the past. And I'm not saying that mistakes weren't made. They definitely were made, but it's up to people to learn from those mistakes and say, well, look, we have to make sure that we carry out our policies, that we're a genuine centre-right government, that people and that our supporters expect of us, without making the same mistakes of the past. And again, that's what Bob Hawke did with looking back at the Whitlam era. I mean, he managed to implement his agenda, but without the chaos and the absolute nonsense that was the Gough Whitlam era. And again, with John Howard, he learned from his mistakes in the Fraser years and in opposition, and he made mistakes in opposition. And I'm sure if you were to talk to him today, he'd admit that himself. But it's also about politics is also about learning from mistakes and make sure you don't make those mistakes again. And because, as you say, what's happened is they've become so reform shy that now people again don't don't know what they actually stand for and can't differentiate between the coalition parties and the ALP.
You mentioned the Fraser years. They're often referred to as the wasted years in Liberal coalition history, and I think it's fair to make an analogy that the past 8 3/4 years of coalition government have been wasted. With the new coalition opposition, obviously it's a process to adjust to opposition. The same thing occurred with the coalition opposition when they lost in 2007. It was very clear when Peter Dutton was elected opposition leader, unopposed. Obviously, he is a warrior of the right, both as Home Affairs Minister, wasn't afraid to take on the dirty lefties, and as Defence Minister, helped negotiate AUKUS. And the impression I got from his first press conference, he said they will be a bad government. He was adopting the Abbott opposition strategy, is when the Albanese government makes mistakes, you make sure that you highlight them relentlessly, and if they break a promise, make sure that they're reminded of it. And so his strategy is to rely on the Albanese government failing, which Albanese was there in the Rudd-Gillard years. So far, they've made sure that the boats are continuing to not come. A lot will hinge on the Jim Chalmers mini budget at the end of this month. What do you make of that type of strategy, just sort of waiting for failure from the government? Because it's likely, but they could manage to. I mean, Chalmers is talking about fiscal responsibility. What do you make of that type of strategy?
Well, I don't think it's going to work. Waiting for your opponents to fall over. I mean, Albanese, I don't think he's, as you say, he's so far made sure that the boats are not coming. And because I think as a member of that government, he realised the Rudd-Gillard years, he realised how toxic that was for them. And these people aren't silly. I don't think they're going to make the same mistakes of the Rudd-Gillard years. So it's no good adopting a look, give him a shovel and he'll dig a hole big enough for himself strategy. I don't think that's going to work. You look at again, we go back to 2009 when notwithstanding all the issues that Kevin Rudd was having, the coalition was still well behind in the polls. People were not happy to give the coalition its vote when it wanted to adopt a Me Too attitude on the emissions trading scheme and the like. So what did the coalition parties do? Even though it was by, at the end of the day, the thinnest of margins, they elected Tony Abbott as leader. As you say, a person who was prepared to prosecute the case and highlight the government's failings day in and day out. Now, within 6 months, he'd managed to knock off Kevin Rudd. The Labor Party got so spooked that they didn't even let Kevin Rudd stand for the next election as Prime Minister to defend his record in government. They went for Julia Gillard. And even so, the coalition almost won government, and then over the succeeding 3 years, the Gillard government again made so many errors and broke obviously the no carbon tax policy that and Abbott was in there day in and day out prosecuting the case. I mean, in 2 elections he took 25 seats off the Labor Party. That's a feat that I don't think will ever be repeated. It's amazing. So Peter Dutton, that's a lesson for Peter Dutton, and he was there during those years. He's been in Parliament since 2001, so he would hopefully have memories of that and realise that you just can't sit by and wait. There are issues you have to address and you have to go in hard on. And he's been given a few opportunities last week with what happened to Andrew Thorburn. There's an issue there that you know, the coalition parties are the ones that have to stand for religious freedom and also for traditional values like Christian values. Now, whether you're Christian or not, atheists, there are many atheists who realise that if it weren't for Christian values, we wouldn't have the legal system and equality before the law and all those kind of things. There are other things I think that Peter Dutton needs to make sure he prosecutes the case on. I think with the Indigenous voice to Parliament, I still can't understand why he has not put or did not appoint Jacinta Price as a shadow Indigenous Affairs Minister. I still can't work that one out. Considering that if anyone has heard Jacinta Price speak, and if anyone's watched her maiden speech, look, you can't help but admire this person and how she articulates her ideas, her conviction, and the fact that, look, she's probably had everything thrown at her by the kitchen sink, and it just washes off her like water off a duck's back. She should be the one out there leading the coalition case against enshrining racial division in the Constitution. So while there have been some encouraging signs, there are still many things I think that Peter Dutton could do, and hopefully after the mini budget he decides to ramp up the pressure, because look, every government's going to get a honeymoon period, but it's no good just sitting by and waiting for them to make a mistake. It's only by putting pressure on your opponents that they're going to start making mistakes. And it wasn't, and that's what Tony Abbott successfully did. He kept arguing and putting pressure on both Rudd and Gillard that in the end they made too many mistakes, and the electorate realised that they were no longer viable. And again, founded on a true centre-right product differentiation. Well, if you elect us, we're going to do this, that, and the other, and then you actually try and do it in government. Within 2 years, you know, the boats had been stopped, the carbon tax had been repealed, and if the bedwetters in the Liberal Party hadn't got the wobblies, I think we would have seen more of a true centre-right agenda being implemented, because I think after that you would have had the economic reforms, the industrial relations reforms, and indeed the reforms to education, which were unforgivable. That the coalition government, while it was in office, did nothing to halt the wokeism in the national curriculum, and that's something that Peter Dutton really should be prosecuting on as well. He really should be labouring that day in and day out, because over the last 2 years, with lockdowns and whatnot, people have seen what their kids are learning at school, and they're not happy. And you only have to see what's happened in America when parents realise they're not happy with what their kids are learning at school. Peter Dutton has to lean into the culture wars, because he'll have the people on his side.
Another critical, important issue that the Albanese government has held the line on is with the Chinese Communist Party. Wong has been very strong, saying we'll talk, but we're certainly not going to be best friends. And it's very clear that well, at least in this mini budget, they're not going to break the stage 3 tax cuts promise, which that's less ammunition for Dutton. But one of the things that the coalition seems united on in opposition, it would have been great if they did it in government, is pushing nuclear power, given that the energy crisis is going to keep getting worse. Cost of living is going to increase. And this is another thing that people have problem with the Liberal Party, is that promise these good things in opposition, but then don't do it in government. We were just talking about 18C was a commitment of Tony Abbott in opposition, was squibbed in government. So nuclear power is great.
Squibbed thanks to people like Scott Morrison, who was one of the big blockers of that, by the way. Look, again, you mentioned nuclear, and again, Scott Morrison went on Paul Murray and said, look, I don't want to engage in the debate on nuclear because I don't want a scare campaign. It's this conservative cowardice, again, this timidity, which, as you say, really annoys Liberal Party supporters. But here, Peter Dutton, like Tony Abbott, had an opportunity with the carbon tax and prosecuted it day in and day out. Remember that promise of Anthony Albanese's before the election that electricity bills would go down $275? What's happened to that? These are things that they should be in and day out. Now, we're going to have this mini budget, but obviously it will probably do nothing to stop electricity prices going through the roof. We heard the other day, what was it, that they're going to go up 35% over the next year? I mean, there's nothing like an issue that hits the voter when it hits them in the hip pocket. And this is where the coalition obviously could play to its traditional strengths. That what did John Howard once say? You're always better off under a coalition government than you will be under a Labor government. And this is the classic case for that. And if they were to pursue nuclear and were to argue cogently for the case nuclear and stare down the fear campaign, as previous coalition leaders have done. I mean, John Howard stared down a fear campaign on the GST successfully. If you present to the people, look, nuclear energy is a viable, clean, cheap alternative if you want to make sure that you don't freeze to death, that you can turn the air conditioning on in the summer, that you don't have to worry about feeding your kids or keeping warm, all these kind of things. I mean, that is a classic hip pocket issue. And it would play to what I think should now be, and what many people now think, even in the Liberal Party circles, should actually be its core constituency, the people in the outer suburbs, what have variously been defined by Sir Robert Menzies as the forgotten people. They were the Howard Battlers, Tony's tradies, and dare I say it now, the quiet Australians. These are people for whom these bread and butter issues are the key. They're not interested in these debates about whether nuclear is viable or not. If you can show them that it will be viable, and there is plenty of research out there, and plenty of ammunition that the coalition can rely on to show that it's viable. If you see anyone who sees their power bill will say, well, look, how can I make sure that I pay because it's killing my business? It is a genuine, as you say, cost of living issue. There is an issue there waiting to be argued cogently and properly. And look, you only have to look at Energy Minister Chris Bowen's record when he was in government. He was the architect of Grocery Watch, which lasted the proverbial 5 minutes when people realised it was a complete shambles and it was shelved. He was the immigration minister under Rudd and Gillard when all the boats kept coming, and then he was shadow treasurer when he was the architect of the whole franking credits policy and went out and said, look, if you don't like our policies, don't vote for us, which has to be the worst political slogan of all time. So there are so many things here. And now he's the architect of a policy, and he still runs around saying, look, renewables are cheaper and because
electric utes, that's what he's pushing now.
Yeah, look, this is nonsense. absolute nonsense, and it's there for the taking. It's there for the taking if you've got a coalition, and in Peter Dutton in particular, who's willing to take the fight up to them, because people are crying out for someone to take up the fight for them. And if they see that someone will take up the fight for them, then I think there'll be a way back into government for the coalition.
You mentioned that the Liberals should aim for the outer suburban seats, and in the outer seats in Sydney and Melbourne, there were swings to the Liberals, but not enough at the moment to flip those seats. The LNP in Queensland held all of their Brisbane seats, but obviously the big story that the media focused on was the Teal Bath winning 4 seats in eastern and northern Sydney, 2 in inner Melbourne, and 1 in Western Australia, Curtin.
Yes.
And because these seats like Curtin, Kooyong, Goldstein, Wentworth, North Sydney, blue ribbon seats, the mainstream media say, see, this is the Liberal Party. They're losing the centre of their party. They really need to come and join modern Australia and embrace integrity, gender equality, climate action. That was the slogan of the Teals. And Susan Leyer, when at that first press conference, when she was elected unopposed deputy leader, made some remarks about women of Australia. We heard you, implying that the Liberal Party hasn't previously listened to women.
Well, look, let's take apart some of that, or as the left like to say, let's unpack that, right? Look at the seats that the Liberals, these blue ribbon seats that the Liberals lost, right? Who were the members of Felinski, Sharma, Cecilia Hammond in WA? The member for who's the member for Goldstein?
It was Tim Wilson. And
Tim Wilson, right? Yeah.
Freidenberg.
Yeah. Right. Now, they were the so-called moderates, right? They're the moderates of the party, up against candidates who, even though they were arguing a lot based on fallacies, they argue from a position of conviction. And when people saw that you've got guys, bedwetters like Sharma and bedwetters like Sharma and Tim Wilson and that kind of ilk, they put up against these Teals who are arguing these positions with conviction. Well, people said, well, look, again, the Liberals at the moment are trying to imitate that kind of policy, and it's a poor photocopy. So we'll just pick the real thing. We'll just pick the real thing. And these are people who, as you know, have little, can afford all this transition to renewables because they're ultra wealthy. Right? So the concerns of putting food on the table and trying to run a small business are far removed from these people. Their concerns are not the traditional forgotten people concerns. And by trying to appease them, the Liberal Party is going down a rabbit hole it's not going to come out of anytime soon. This is what Sir Robert Menzies realised, and I think at the time, the father of Alexander Downer, Sir Alec Downer, I think mention something that I was going back a couple of months ago after the federal election, looking at that old 1994 series, The Liberals, which was on the ABC by Prue Goward, and it was produced for the 50th anniversary of the Federal Liberal Party. And Alec Downer said to his son, look, don't listen to these wealthy business people because they're self-serving. They're not, they only care about themselves and not necessarily about anything in terms of the good of the party or the good of society or things like that. And we're sort of seeing the same kind of thing. I mean, Simon Holmes at court, these kind of people.
Well, he was a member of Josh Frydenberg's Kooyong 200 back in the day.
Yeah, I know. And these are people who are self-serving. They're not there for this independence and integrity thing. I mean, you only have to look at where they've got all their interests tied up in, and we're not going to go down that road too much because otherwise we could be up for slander and libel and things like that. But the fact of the matter is, you say that they didn't get enough in those. There was a swing to the Liberals in those outer seats, but not enough. Well, that's where the potential is, isn't it? It's slowly. That is where those seats. If the Liberals actually concentrate properly, or the coalition concentrates properly on those seats, they will not only retain the ones that they already have in the outer suburbs, but they'll actually win some more. I mean, the flip side of it, again, of this Teals thing is look at the National Party. They actually retained all these seats. They didn't lose any seats. So the parties that actually argued from a position of conviction gained, either retained or gained seats. It was the parties that tried to, like the Liberals, that tried to imitate the other side rather than argue from a position of conviction that actually lost. They're not going to win an election by trying to appease these kind of people. An appeaser, as Winston Churchill said, is someone who feeds a crocodile hoping it's going to eat him last. You only have to look at electoral trends around the world to see that kind of politics isn't going to get you anywhere. Boris Johnson won in 2019. That red wall broke down that red wall, promising Brexit. He's since let them down with that net zero climate change nonsense of his. But look, in Italy, it was the working class people that voted for Giorgia Meloni. In the US, it's the working class people that are voting for the Republicans. And there's no reason to think why it's not going to happen here. We're already starting to see trends of that nature. If only the Liberal Party would actually argue and articulate policies for them, for these people, that's when they're going to attract. That's when they're going to attract those votes even more. And it's happened in the past. It happened with John Howard. It happened with Tony Abbott, and it'll happen again.
At the recent CPAC Australia conference in Sydney, Federal Liberal Vice President Tina McQueen said that she was glad that all the moderates were defeated, and she'd been wanting to get rid of them for years. Peter Dutton on Insiders last Sunday said that those weren't good comments, and they won't be made again. Like, really, it really slapped her down. And so Dutton clearly thinks that they can win back some of those seats. I'm not sure he hasn't outlined a strategy. Certainly with the way that some of the Teals have carried on, such as Monique Ryan in Kooyong, I think Frydenberg, he'd have a good chance of winning that back. But Dutton, he's been eager to say we're still going to be the broad church of the Conservatives, the small L Liberals, like how John Howard described the party. It's clear that he doesn't want to sort of be in one direction.
Well, it's okay to have a broad church, but when it was a broad church, it was successful when you had a Conservative as leader. John Howard was from the Conservative wing of the party. Tony Abbott was from the Conservative wing of the party. And Malcolm Fraser was from, at the time, was from the Conservative wing of the party. Remember, he was up against his predecessor, whom he toppled, was Billy Snedden, who was part of those infamous Victorian small L Liberals that Sir Robert Menzies decried in that letter to his daughter Heather, who he said at the time, back in 1974, that they would stand for anything if they thought it worth a few votes. And he described it as tragic. Now, this is where I said before, Peter Dutton is been a bit of a disappointment in that sense, because he's still trying to straddle both sides of the fence. But it's okay to have a broad church because you need to hear alternative views. But at the end of the day, the Liberals are only successful electorally when they have they have that component in the party, but you've got the Conservative as leader. Now, you only have to look at, just going back to those, I mean, if Peter Dutton thinks he can win some of those seats back, well, he can't do what the Liberals did to Catherine Deves in Warringah. I mean, those kind of issues would I think you'd have the majority of the population on your side on those issues that Catherine Deves was arguing on. But because her campaign was so sabotaged by the Liberals, I mean, they wouldn't even let her talk publicly. I mean, wouldn't let her go on any TV interviews. It wasn't until I think Chris Kenny sort of snuck up on her at Sky during the election campaign for Sky that she gave a doorstop. They nominated her, but then they weren't prepared to let her argue her case. Well, you're not going to win any contest if you hide your light under a bushel. You've got to let their candidates go out and argue the case. And maybe you might say in Josh Frydenberg's old seat of Kooyong, if they put up a true Conservative, someone who's actually going to expose Monique Ryan's for all her failings, they might have a chance. But I wouldn't see them winning them all back anytime soon. They might get one or two back, but I don't think that's going to be a long-term successful electoral strategy, considering that the issues that those people argue for and the people in those electorates are far removed from the rest of Australia. I mean, don't forget, these are the electorates that all voted overwhelmingly for a republic in 1999, but the rest of Australia just didn't want a bar of it. So I don't see that electoral success for the coalition is going to lie by winning back those seats. They have to really go for these people for whom the economy and the economic downturn, electricity prices, cost of living issues are really going to bite. And then they can argue to their traditional strengths as better economic managers.
Given that Catherine Deves, there was a 4% swing to Zali Steggall, the incumbent Teal, I don't think they're going to be pre-selecting Catherine Deves type candidates in those inner city seats going forward. Another flashpoint at the recent CPAC conference was former a Liberal Senator Nick Minchin asked about does anything need to change or be reformed in the Liberal Party?
To be frank, I don't know that the Liberal Party needs a whole lot of changing. It has profound...
You're joking.
Hey, calm down, will you?
I thought we were a Conservative gathering.
You're worse than a socialist audience. Give me a chance to speak.
I haven't seen a audience turn like that since Malcolm Turnbull said to the New South Wales Liberal Conference, we're not ruled by factions or deals in back rooms.
Look, I wasn't in the room. I did attend CPAC, but I had to leave by that stage to catch the plane home. So what I've seen from that is what I've seen played on that on various media outlets and what people have told me who were there. Look, and I wrote about it in the Epoch Times recently. Look, Nick Minchin also said, look, you've got to go back to the Liberal Party's statement, "We believe." And if you go on that, yeah, and there you go. Thank you very much. You've got to go to the Liberal Party statement, "We believe." Now, the Liberal Party doesn't need to change those statements on there because they talk about freedom of speech, freedom of association, lower taxes, smaller government, all those kind of things. But it's the fact that they didn't, it's the fact that they abandoned Scott Morrison, Malcolm Turnbull, and their fellow travellers abandoned those values. And that's where Tina McQueen was right when she said, well, look, we've got rid of some of these bedwetters. We need to get rid of the rest of them now. So it's not, it's the Liberal Party's values, in a sense, don't need to change. We need to put people in there to stand up and defend them and argue for them and prosecute them, because it's only when that's done that people will consider them worthy of government. The other thing I'll mention is Nick mentioned his reaction to the booing, I think, is interesting because he was actually one of John Howard's foot soldiers on a lot of the conservative causes. He argued strident. He was one of the leading campaigners against for the no case, I should say, in the Republican referendum. He stood alongside one of the few. I mean, John Howard, I think, once remarked he wishes he had a lot more people around the cabinet table to help him prosecute some of those conservative ideals he was trying to implement. But Nick Minchin was one of those. So, look, his statement in itself probably came out wrong, and
yes,
that's why it wasn't appreciated by the audience. But again, you've actually got to go back and look to it. And I think what he definitely was trying to say was, look, it's not the values of the parties that need to change. You need to find people in there who will stand up and defend them, and that's why the Liberals have been performing so poorly electorally, because these people have abandoned the values of the Liberal Party.
And there would have been a lot in that audience who were scoffing at Nick Minchin's remarks, would have voted for the United Australia Party, or Palmer 3.0, One Nation, the Liberal Democrats, because John Ruddick, who wrote the book Make the Liberal Party Great Again, decided in the end it couldn't be made great again, and so ran for the Liberal Democrats, and he's going to be running for them again at the New South Wales state election. And in Victoria, Ralph Babet took a Senate seat off the Liberals' Greg Marabella, and Pauline Hanson's re-election came at the expense of the LNP's Amanda Stoker. Yeah.
Look, the Liberals again shot themselves in the foot as far as that was concerned, because they preferenced, and across seats and in the Senate, they preferenced, in a lot of cases, the ALP ahead of One Nation, ahead of the Lib Dems, ahead of Palmer. I mean, in my seat, the Liberal Democrat candidate was fourth on the ballot paper, was preference fourth on the ballot paper, and should have been at least, yes, should have been second. Because these are if you look at the statement "We believe," and you look at what the parties like the Lib Dems and One Nation and Palmer were arguing for ideologically, their fellow travellers. So, and with our preferential voting system, the Liberals, I think, again, did themselves an absolute disservice by preferencing the ALP ahead of these ideological fellow travellers. And look what they've done. They've gifted the Senate to the ALP, who only need to have the Greens on side, which will happen 95% of the time.
And David Pocock, what is it? He's not really a Teal person. Like,
he's an independent or something. Yeah.
He got money from Climate 200, but he's pretty much like a greenie in most of his views.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that's where, again, a lot of that angst would have been coming at Nick Minchin. The other thing I'll mention about that, just by the by, is the room was, I mean, as I said, I wasn't there for that presentation, but I was there until the presentation beforehand, the presentations beforehand, when you had Topher Field's presentation, him on the lockdowns in Melbourne, battleground Melbourne. You had that, and look, I watched that, and like most people in that room, I mean, we'd heard about it and seen it, a lot of this over the last 2 years, but having those four people go up there and speak about their experiences, and when it was considered that Scott Morrison and the Liberals did nothing, what did Scott Morrison say? He gives Daniel Andrews his every support through the lockdowns, and said absolutely nothing when Zoe Bueller was arrested in her own home. When people were shot at with rubber bullets, he didn't say a word. So people had memories of that, and that the Liberals did nothing. You had presentations on the national curriculum and how bad it was. You had Senator Malcolm Roberts beforehand saying, well, look, you know, as I've just pointed out, the Liberals preferenced the ALP ahead of...
he didn't hold back in his presentation about what the Liberals had done in government.
That's right, exactly. And people that heard all of that were reminded of all of that and were fired up. So the context to that reaction to Nick Minchin's, as I say, what he said in itself wasn't necessarily wrong, but the way it came out and the context in which it was given, I think the reaction was there for all to see, and probably was. Some people don't condone it. Some people say, look, it was understandable. And like I said, and this is where I think now the Liberals have an opportunity to rediscover those values and reach out, I hope, to these ideological fellow travellers in the minor parties to get them back on side, because, these are people, we talk about votes being lost to the Teals, but the Liberals lost a whole lot of votes to these minor parties. I think I pointed that out in my Epoch Times article, that Nick Cater said that something like over 600,000 votes were lost across the country to minor parties. Now, the Liberals, if they want to win government, they have to work out how to try and get these votes back. And these are natural. This is the natural constituency, the Liberal voters. I mean, who was it, Textor and Turnbull, that boasted that these people won't have anywhere else to go? Well, they found somewhere else to go. They found somewhere else to go, and if the Liberals want to get back in government and get back in government quickly, they have to get these votes back.
The Liberal Party is not doing too well at the state level. I mean, in your state, Western Australia, in March 2021, the Liberal Party was reduced to a rump, 2 seats in the lower house. The Nationals, the official opposition, they lost the South Australian election in March. The interesting thing about that election was it was a socially progressive Liberal Premier, Stephen Marshall, rightly called the Marshmallow, losing to a socially conservative Labor leader in Peter Malinauskas. And here in Victoria, we have our election in a month and a half, and Matthew Guy's strategy for the past 6 months has just been to say "me too" to everything that Dan Andrews is proposing, such as the treaty with Victoria's Indigenous tribes, a treaty with itself, supporting net zero. This is a horrendous Instagram post by the Liberal Victoria account, which has the climate change combo, solar shaker fries, cola net zero emissions, tree-based burger. The policies are better under Liberal Victoria. And they're also trying to fight the election on what are traditional Labor strengths, such as health and public transport. And this is their TikTok rap on these issues.
One thing to know about Dan Andrews. He's been health minister or premier for 12 years. We're in the middle of a health crisis, but Dan doesn't care. He cut $2 billion from health. What a nightmare. But somehow he still found $35 billion to invest in one train. Is he insane? Vic has the most debt in the country, but he wants to raise it further. We can't let this occur. It's time to end his career.
Okay, apologies to our audience for playing that.
Look, I think I've said before, and I'll say it again. If you're going to try and imitate your opponent, people are going to choose the real thing every time. And I don't see what this kind of strategy is going to achieve. I mean, you've had one of the, I think it's the most lockdown city in the world in Melbourne.
Yeah, 262 days. I lived through it, and it was horrendous.
So many lives shattered, and the health effects of the lockdown are now being seen with delayed cancer diagnoses, the mental health issues of all of this, the separated families. Why? I don't know why. I can't understand when you've got the precedents that have been set in Western Australia when Zach Kirkup, who was the Liberal leader last year, wanted to close down coal-fired power stations before Mark McGowan did. Went Me Too on all the health advice when at the start of the state election campaign last year, Mark McGowan locked up 2.5 million people over one positive case.
Which didn't affect anyone else.
Exactly. So they had the perfect ammunition there to say, look, this is insane, to present an alternative. And they squibbed it. And, you know, we saw in South Australia this policy, this idea that we try and out-left our opponents just didn't work. If you try something 10 times and it doesn't work, it ain't going to work the 11th time. So, look, I think the Liberals are obviously determined to remain in opposition with this kind of nonsense. Look, it's one thing to say, well, look, we have to try and neutralise issues, but this is the whole point of this focus group polling. And also trying not to get called names by the mainstream media, and the people on social media avoid some hashtag. That's right. Well, it's what was it? 5% of people are on Twitter or something. Yet they run the narrative. I mean, look at how Ron DeSantis stands up to the mainstream media in Florida. He calls them out. He stands up to them. He argues with them. He points out where they're wrong. It's all this conservative cowardice. They're just too afraid to argue, too afraid of scare campaigns, too afraid to get called names, as you say. And when people see that you display cowardice, well, I don't see that wins any votes. And this kind of cheap TikTok stuff, yeah, like you say, you apologise to the audience for displaying it. I don't see how that. I don't see who can be impressed by that. Well, we will find out if this strategy works this time in a month and a half time with our election. That's right. Sorry, Tim. And the other thing too, I mean, with that whole Andrew Thorburn thing, I mean, they've been given a gift. They've been given a gift to argue for religious freedom. And I'll never forget Michael Kroger on Sky News election coverage said if the Liberals had argued for the protection of people's right to freely practice their religion, they would have won in a canter. Well, there's a classic. It's been handed to Matthew Guy on a silver platter, yet I don't think he's said much about it. And the other thing too, the votes, if you look at the federal election vote distribution, votes, there was a swing to the Liberals in those outer suburban seats that suffered horrendously from those lockdowns. So there are two issues there that the Liberals can prosecute. Forget about all this other rubbish, but oh no, we've got to go woke, and it's going to send them broke, I tell you.
And also there's the New South Wales state election in March, where there was high hopes for Dominic Perrottet as probably the first conservative Liberal premier they'd had, but he's just towed the moderate line, and there doesn't seem to be any difference between him now and Matt Keane, his new deputy and treasurer.
That's it. Matt Keane seems to be running the show there, and look, all that can be said for this is that maybe we get rid of all these wets, and that the party can actually focus on attracting Conservatives, because this might be a winter, but it's during the winter that you do the pruning and that you see growth again. So this is the silver lining people are trying to see, and we don't want to spread doom and gloom all the time, but hopefully this is what finally shakes the Liberals when they lose all these elections horrendously, that all these people, all these apparatchiks that Turnbull said didn't run the party will in fact do run the party, who stand for nothing and compromise on everything. Finally, they will be gone, and you can actually have a situation where there's renewal and true and people with true conservative ideals can actually enter into the party. And finally, the Liberals might actually realise what's been done in other countries with conservative parties is you actually give a membership the say in electing the leader. And I think that would be a great incentive for people to join the party if you actually give them a say in joining the leader. Initially, I was against this kind of thing, but looking at what's happened in Canada, where they've elected the Tories over there, as they call themselves, have elected a true conservative leader, and he's up 10 points. He's thrashing Trudeau at the moment. The Tories in the UK elected Bojo, and they elected Liz Truss against Rishi Sunak. Liz Truss obviously has got off to an interesting start, shall we say. But again,
you're being polite there.
Yeah, as I said. But look, what is she actually arguing? Look, the implementation and the arguing for all of that, people can talk about that, and obviously there were mistakes made there. But when you actually look at it, she's actually trying to reduce taxes, and she's starting to make noises about backtracking from this net zero nonsense. Whereas Rishi Sunak would have, I think, was on the whole with building back better and levelling up and all of that nonsense. So I think there's something to be said for actually giving the membership a say in electing the leader of the party, and you might actually get a leader who actually reflects what the people in the party want, what the membership want, and might be more in line with those statements we believe that the party says it stands for, but really around the country hasn't been able to find a leader to fight for them.
They mention on that subject in Victoria, even though Matthew Guy has taken to the party to the left, and the reason he really can't stand up for Andrew Thorburn is because he kicked out Bernie Finn for his pro-life beliefs. But it's Democratic branch, the Victorian Liberal Party, and they've pre-selected a lot of conservative candidates to run.
Holland, more redeeming, and the guy who I forget his name, who's standing against Andrews in his seat of Mulgrave, I think he's a rusted-on conservative too.
I can't remember his name either, but he was impressive on Rita Panahi's program. So internal democracy, because you need an energized base to get the message out.
That's right. And that was the thing about the election, the federal election, that the Liberals were struggling to find those volunteers, that base, that are happy to stand out on a Saturday morning in the rain, in the cold, and hand out how to vote cards. Well, they were struggling to find those because the base felt abandoned. And I think what's happening in Victoria, as you've seen, is people are just trying to ignore Matthew Guy and all that, and fighting, shall we say, hand-to-hand combat in individual seats, and hoping that, like you say, internalised democracy will win the day, and promoting the conservative credentials of these candidates.
Well, it's been great to hear your insights tonight, Rocco. Even though we've given the Liberals quite the whack this past hour, I will say that I think the predictions of the Liberal Party's demise are premature, because they have
Yes.
had their bad periods, but they do come back often with a vengeance.
Well, like I said, I mean, yeah, it's quoting like Mark Twain there. I mean, the reports of my demise are completely exaggerated. As I said earlier, hopefully this is a winter for the Liberals that leads to pruning, to renewal, to reform, and to retaking government. They spent 13 long years in opposition federally, and then came back, and we've had probably. Look, like any government, it made its mistakes, but we had one of the best governments this country's ever had. And Sir Robert Menzies was turfed out in 41, and look, he came back and became Australia's greatest Prime Minister. So, yeah, we shouldn't, we've given them a kick up the backside, but let's hope that the kick up the backside is worth it and they learn from it.
Well, certainly there needs to be some sort of opposition in your own state of Western Australia. You've also written about Mark McGowan's new proposed emergency powers.
Yes, these look. It's a state of emergency that's ending, but the emergency, it's just been transferred to the police commissioner, who can declare a COVID-19 emergency more or less when he sees fit. The appointment of COVID officers who can just simply enter into your home, trespass on private property, into people's cars, can do anything reasonably necessary to prevent the spread of the virus. I mean, it's this openly vague language which just sends shivers down anyone's spine. I just shudder to I mean, getting the sniffles now has become a criminal offence, because you'll lose the right to self-incrimination under this legislation. So look, it is an addiction to power, and as we know, Lord Acton said that what power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely, and that's what's happened in Western Australia. Precisely because there hasn't been an opposition to argue the case, that it's just gone along with everything.
Yeah, that is sadly what has been the state of Australia this past 2 years. But we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Rocco, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon in the not too distant future, and keep up with your contributions in both written and on the airwaves, because they're important.
Thanks, Tim. It's been a pleasure to be with you, and yeah, I look forward to speaking to you again soon.
This is WilmsFront, brought to you by the unshackled.net.
And we're back live. So I hope you enjoyed Rocco's contribution. I was following the discussion in the live chat. There was certainly some strong opinions from all of you. There is a question over on entropy from some random bloke for $3 Australian. He super chatted on Tuesday, I believe. So thank you for another super chat. He says, can we discuss mass immigration and changing demographics as one of the reasons centre-right parties in the West are losing? Well, that is the case in certain nations, but going to something myself and Rocco said off air, I was talking about the changing electoral demographics in Melbourne. The inner city white areas, they're the ones voting for the Teals in Kooyong and Goldstein. But the southeast of Melbourne and the northwest of Melbourne, they're slowly voting more to the right, and they've got a lot of Indian and Asian migrants there who are socially conservative in their values and also they're entrepreneurial as well. For example, going back to the March for the Babies in Melbourne on Saturday, the pro-abortion counter-protesters are extremely white. I didn't see in the photos that I saw any women of color, but it was very multicultural at the pro-life march. Well, the main event, I should call it, and the prayer was given by an Asian pastor, and the new Victorian director of the Australian Christian Lobby, Jasmine Wan, obviously an Asian name. So yes, a migration is changing demographics in Melbourne, but actually to a conservative free market bent, Lady of Shalott, yes, all the white delinquents turn out for every degenerate cause. And Pico Osman says, the reality is Australia has been largely sheltered from the worst effects of mass migration. Yes, we have wage stagnation and racist affirmative action, but that won't galvanize voters. And Lady of Charlotte says, that is heartening to hear. Many of the Indians I meet are pretty based. Now, I will be publishing more content from the March for the Babies. So far, I've published my interview with Bernie Finn, leader of the March for the Babies, and well, now Democratic Labor Party MLC. And I also published my interview with Lee Jones, Family First candidate for Southeast Metro region. I am going to publish more highlights from the march itself in the coming days. Tomorrow there will be no Trad Tasman Talk in the normal time slot. We had the makeup show with Duo on Tuesday evening. Thank you for those who tuned in for that, but Stephen is still having internet difficulties, so we'll be back to Fridays next Friday, which will be the 21st of October. I don't know whether at that stage that'll be with Duo or Stephen. I hope that Stephen's internet is fixed by then, but it was certainly, yes, he was, as I mentioned, he was one of the people that switched from Optus, but doesn't seem like a good idea in hindsight. There was a suspected cyber attack on one of the health insurers, Medibank Private, this morning, but they said no customer data was compromised. Well, at least that we hope. So I'll be back next on Monday with another Tim's News explosion. Well, there'll be a lot to cover, 8:30 p.m. Melbourne time on the WilmsFront channels. And I'll let you know by then if there's another WilmsFront this time next Thursday, and definitely Trad Tasman Talk back next Friday as well. And also make sure that you keep checking out the Unshackled YouTube channel for new reports from Tiger Mountain with Richard Wollstonecroft. Thank you, Naughty Design, again, for all your feedback and all of your support. Make sure you keep checking out the unshackled.net as we've got new articles published. The newsletter will be coming out this Saturday as well. And also the unshackled.net has our productions archive as well. So please, everyone, stay safe, stay sane, stay free, stay healthy. And if you're in Victoria, New South Wales, stay dry and don't drive through floodwaters. I mean, the worst, I think, is going to be over in the next 24 hours, but there's still going to be a lot of water around. So don't be one of those bloody idiots. Good night, everybody, and have a good weekend.
Thanks for tuning in to WilmsFront. Visit timwilms.com to view the archive of episodes, and keep visiting the unshackled.net to view all our shows, and to keep up with the latest real news and analysis.